Hello and welcome to the My YouTube channel. As you can see, we have a bit of a change of location today. So I'm actually trying out doing a YouTube video in my hotel room. So I'm traveling this week to our company's kickoff in Orlando. I wanted to make sure that I got a video out this week. Today's video is coming to you directly from a hotel room in Orlando. Not quite sure how this is going to turn out because I'm on my work laptop and I don't normally have my usual recording equipment with me. I've got my portable DJI mic, so we'll see how this goes. So yeah, today's video, I'm going to cover something which I come across quite often, and that is around performance in Azure Virtual Desktop, and also applies to Windows 365 as well, because when we look at the cost and performance, and there's a couple of major factors that we have to go through. So what I'm going to do in today's video, I'm going to walk through those with you, and then decide how you come to some decisions and how those decisions can affect kind of the cost and the performance of that solution as well. And it's something which I do all day, every day with my customers. So hopefully you'll be able to take something away from today's video. All right, so that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's get started. I'd say probably the major factors to look at when we're deciding, number one, what's the performance of the sort of VDI solution is going to be like? And secondly, how much is it going to cost us? So obviously, when we run a multi-session host or a single session host, we run on certain VM SKUs, right? And the choosing of that VM SKU is critical. The common mistake I see customers make all the time is they'll just pick a VM SKU and then just leave it at that. They won't fine tune it. They won't go back and look at the metrics and say, okay, maybe we need to fine tune that. So first of all, let's have a look at our choices. So when you have a virtual machine within Azure, there's three things which it consists of. It consists of the CPU SKU. Is it an Intel? Is it an AMD? How many cores does it have? That kind of thing. Is it like a D series? Is it an F series? Is it an E series? And then we have the disk. Is it a standard HDD? Is it a standard SSD? Or is it premium SSD? So we're going to walk through all those different components. First of all, let's look to see what type of VM SKU we're going to be choosing. Most people by default pick the D series. And when we look at a VM within Azure, we have something called the CPU to memory ratio, right? And that's generally derived so the three main SKUs I'm going to focus on today is going to be the D series, the F series, and the E series, right? So as I mentioned, most people lean towards the D series and just stick with that because that's a one-to-one mapping of CPU to memory. So imagine if you've got like 4 CPUs, you have 16 gigs of RAM, okay? So that's the default which most people pick. So we've got like version 3, version 4, version 5, and now the new version 6 as well. So that's basically how old the CPU is. So you want to be going to the latest generation as possible. Common mistake I see, if you go to the Azure portal, it'll default to V3. So if you want the best performance for your bang for your buck, basically choose the D5 or the D6 if that's available within your region. And the next decision we need to make, do we want a D series, do we want an E series, or do we want an F series? The D series, as I said, is the default go-to, which most people pick. For memory optimized workloads, we have something called the E series. So imagine on the D series, you had 4 cores and 16 gigs of RAM. On the E series, you probably have 4 cores and 32 gigs of RAM. This by far is the most popular option, which I see at the moment. The reason being is because what you'll generally find is a workload, which has an office workload, and the limitation is not going to be on CPU, it's going to be on memory, right? Because we're using a lot of RAM-heavy apps like Outlook, we're using a lot of Google Chrome or Edge, so we're consuming more memory than CPU. Therefore, when we look at the stats, it's generally leaning towards having a memory-optimized workload. And what that will essentially mean is it will mean that I can put more users onto my hosts, right? Yes, it may cost you a little bit extra to have a E series over a D series, but you'll be able to put more users on there. So it actually may save you money in the long term. And the way to analyze this data is to basically look at the metrics and then see what the performance is like. So if I'm logged onto a session host, I'm looking at the task manager and I'm saying, okay, we're using, I don't know, 10% CPU, but we're using 90% memory. We know we need to go towards an E series, right? And because what we can then do is, say you're using 10% CPU, if we drop it down to the half a cores, then we know it's going to use 20% CPU, right? But we're doubling the memory. So that 90% memory now becomes 50% memory or 45% memory. And then we can increase the number of users by maybe 2, 3, or 5 onto that session host. So that's how we worked that one out. And then the second thing we need to look is how many users can we fit onto that host. So again, it depends how heavy your workload is, because we have something called CPU to user ratio. By default, Microsoft tell you for the general workload it's 4:1. So 4 users per vCPU. So you can imagine you've got a 4-core CPU, and you may be able to have 4 cores times 4 users, right? If you want a 4:1 ratio. So generally what I normally do is I normally start off at 2:1, because looking at different environments, that generally seems to be a good starting point to have. So imagine if you got a 4-core machine, you would start with 8 users on that machine and then run that workload and see how it responds to the users. And then if the users say, okay, it's a bit sluggish, then we can start to move to 1:1, where we have maybe an 8-core machine, and we'll have eight users on there. Now, if performance is a priority or end user is a priority for you, then I'd say 1:1 is a good thing to aim for, because it seems to, from working with different customers, it seems to work okay for them. 2:1 is a bit hit and miss depending on the workload, but 1:1 is a good solid ground if you want guaranteed performance. Now, the only other thing I'd say is sometimes what I generally see with customers is they say everything's looking good on paper, right? So you log on to the session host, the memory's at 80%, the CPU's at 80%, the disk IOPS is looking good, but the user still reports sluggish performance. If you are getting that situation where the users are reporting, hey, I'm not having a good experience here, then maybe you want to decrease the number of users you get in per session host and see if that helps. A couple of factors which that could be is probably around the FA logic connections onto storage. But also what people tend to forget about is the applications which they're connected to at the back end as well. So the user reporting sluggish performance is not necessarily a problem with the session host. It could be a problem with the actual application they're using itself, because the front end may be in the US or the back end might be in India or something. So that's a key consideration to look at when users saying, hey, we're having a really bad experience here. Okay. So that's generally how we're going to pick our CPUs. As to say, D series seems to be the go-to, but I definitely see E series being more optimal in many environments which you look at, purely because it has that higher kind of memory to CPU ratio. So the next thing that we look at is the disk. As you say now, I'm going to go back a bit. So I've talked about multi-session host, but now let's talk about personal session host. Obviously, with personal session host, you're having one user. Now, I would say if you're doing personal session hosts, 2 cores and 8 gigs of RAM is not enough. I've seen this with many customers. Generally, we recommend 4 cores and 16 gigs of RAM for personal session desktops. If you are deploying single session desktops and you are using Defender for Endpoint and Office apps and stuff, then I highly recommend doing 4 cores and 16 gigs of RAM. Unless you're extremely cost conscious and you're happy for the users to put up with that kind of a bit slightly sluggish performance. But that's my recommendation. The next thing we'll go to disks. And so what disk do we want to choose? Now, this is quite interesting because I used to presume that for multi-session host, premium SSDs would be the way to go. But I've spoken to many customers who are using standard SSDs on multi-session hosts, and it's working perfectly fine for them. If we talk about the difference between a standard SSD and a premium SSD, from a kind of IOPS perspective, the base IOPS is the same. So we get 500 IOPS, but the difference is the premium SSD has a higher burst capability, so we can burst the IOPS. So think about those morning logon stones. But it also has a bit more throughput as well. If there's any kind of disk heavy applications, then they're going to really benefit from that. If we talk about how many users logging onto the session host in the morning, I think Microsoft state that for the morning log on, you need around 50 IOPS per user. Steady state, I think, is around 5 or 10, I can't remember which one. If we think about how many users we're putting onto a session host, if we've got 16 users logging on in the morning at the same time, that could potentially push that up way beyond like 1,000 IOPS if we're using 50 IOPS as a base. In situations where you've got, I'd say, more than 5, 6, 7 users logging onto a session host, I'd say premium is the way to go. If you're only getting a low number of users per host, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 users, you're probably going to be okay with standard, I'd say. So that has quite a big factor in the cost as well, that you're having with those disks. So this is why there's a lot of thought process which has to go in to look at this. Now, the one thing I will say is look at the data. The data is going to drive you to that decision. Don't just go and deploy it. The biggest thing which I see with customers is they will go deploy the defaults. So they'll deploy like a D8 or a D16. They'll work out how many users they get onto, and then that's it. Okay. They don't go back and revisit that data, because a lot of the time what I basically see is we look at the data and we're only using like 50% of the memory or 50% of the CPU. And therefore we're leaving money on the table, right? Because that's costing you money. Generally what we advise then is, okay, so if we're running a D16 and we're only using like 50% of the resources, we can say, maybe we want to drop down to a D8, or maybe we want to turn on less hosts, or maybe we want to increase the number of users per session host. But the way I normally approach it is I prefer to have a lot of smaller hosts than not as many big hosts, because you'll get better performance. Because there does seem to be a tipping point within Azure with multi-session hosts. Is if you put more than like 16, 17 users on there, even though memory and CPU are looking good, the performance, the user experience will start to drop. So I'd rather have 2 D8s with 8 users per host than like one D16 with 16 users per host. Yes, the cost is going to be slightly higher because you got that extra disk, but it means that the performance for those users is going to be a better experience, right? So that's generally what I say to customers, like, okay, you've got a D16, you're only using 50% of the resources, let's drop it down to a D8 and then get those kind of CPU memory up to running at 85, 90%. And then you've got a good base between user experience and cost as well. So yeah, that's it for this week. It's a short video to say I'm traveling, so I don't really have the time that I normally have to do all these edits and stuff. So this is what I wanted to share. It's some information with you. If you've got any questions, please drop them in the comment below. I'm interested to see what experience you have with your single session or multi-session environments in regards to VM selection and disk selection. Stay tuned next week. Hopefully I'll be back in my home office next week. Have a good day. Goodbye.